Hello, Matt here with Downtime Activities. This is the Help Action Episode 2. The Help Action is a series where we break down kind of D&D or RPG related ideas or rules. We give you guys a good understanding and some usable advice on them. Today we're tackling a kind of big one that's very near and dear to my heart, and that's the crafting rules of 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. I love artificers, I love crafting rules, but the crafting rules leave something to be desired in D&D a lot of the time, and there's some confusion on what rules are and aren't official. So we're going to kind of be breaking that down, telling you what the rules are that Wizards has released, our opinion on them, or at least my opinion on them, and how best to use them in your game.
Alright, so D&D 5th edition has two main places that you can go to find your basic crafting rules for mundane and magical items. The first of which, the original rules, were released in the Dungeon Master's Guide. We'll go over those first. The DMG rules start with non-magical item crafting. The requirements for this are an appropriate tool proficiency for the item being crafted, access to the materials or locations needed to craft it, and then the rules kind of get a little more number crunchy from there. The basic gist is this: 5 gold pieces of progress are made each day spent crafting the item. This 5 gold piece per day adds up to be the total cost of the item attempting to be crafted. The crafter must also pay 1/2 of that total value of the item in order to craft. For example, plate armor, which typically costs 1,500 gold pieces, would instead cost 750 gold pieces, but take 300 days to craft, with a single person crafting for 5 gold pieces worth of crafting per day. Other characters can help in this process if they have the required tool proficiency, and they can contribute an additional 5 gold pieces of work each day towards the progress on crafting that item. So with our previous example, if 3 characters all had smith tool proficiencies and worked together to craft a suit of plate armor, they would instead only take 100 days to craft it, still costing them 750 gold pieces in the process. The magical item crafting in the DMG is quite a bit more complicated than this, and has a lot more rules and requirements that go into the process. The basic chart that is used to describe how much needs to be spent to craft it has a level and gold piece requirement. This is broken down by rarity. So a common magic item costs 100 gold pieces and you must be at least 3rd level to craft it, where a legendary item costs 500,000 gold pieces and you must be at least 17th level. Other requirements are a formula in order to know how to craft the magic item. The character crafting, at least the lead character crafting, must be a spellcaster with spell slots and the ability to cast any and all spells that the item can cast. It may also require special ingredients and/or additional tool proficiencies at the DM's discretion. Whereas in mundane crafting, 5 gold pieces of progress are made per day, for magical crafting, 25 gold pieces of progress are made per day. This 25 gold pieces is meant to add up to that total cost described in the chart before. So for a common magic item, which costs 100 gold pieces, it would take 4 days to craft. If the item being crafted produces a spell, then the person crafting it must know that spell, and during each day of crafting, expend a spell slot of an appropriate level for the spell that would be produced by the item. They must also provide all components for the spell. If a spell has consumed components, then those components are consumed in the creation of the magic item. It is only consumed once if the item being made only produces that spell once, such as a spell scroll, but if a spell can be used more than once by the magic item, then the prerequisite item, the consumable component, must be provided each day of crafting. There's a lot here, a lot of rules and stuff to kind of get into, so to break this down, we're going to just use an example. The Staff of Healing is a rare magic item found in the DMG. To craft it, you would need to have a recipe for a Staff of Healing. You'd have to be at least level 6, and you would have to know and be able to cast the spells Cure Wounds, a 1st level spell, Lesser Restoration, a 2nd level spell, and Mass Cure Wounds, a 5th level spell. Since Mass Cure Wounds is a 5th level spell, you would actually have to be a 9th level character in order to have that spell slot, because you would have to expend a 1st, 2nd, and 5th spell slot each day spent crafting the item. Luckily, these spells don't have any material components that are consumed, so none of those have to be required in this. Woodcarver's tool proficiency would also likely be required here, and any other special ingredients that the DM decides. Once all of these things are supplied, the cost would be 5,000 gold pieces, since it is a rare magic item, and 200 days of work, if working alone. If you somehow managed to have a 4-person party that all had skills that were usable in this crafting, you could cut that time down to be 50 days. This system leaves quite a bit to be desired. In my opinion, it is not great. There's a lot of problems with how much time things take, and a lot is done by this system to try and make things feel pretty realistic. You want someone crafting a suit of armor to have to spend quite a bit of time, and you don't want to overly incentivize players to stop adventuring and just sit around making cheap weapons and armor and selling them instead of going and slaying dragons. But for a player who wants to really dive into crafting and use that as part of their character, this system is really punishing. The DMG also has a little section in it about creating your own magic items. This is a pretty simplistic set of rules and should really only be used as kind of a basic guideline for the power level of items being created, but is useful to know about. The chart breaks down by rarity of magic item what level of spell it can produce, this being a first level spell for a common magic item, a third level spell for a non-common magic item, so on and so forth. This level is the level intended for the item to be able to produce once per day. So if you had an uncommon magic item, it could produce a third level spell effect once per day. It goes in to say that it could also produce a lower level spell effect multiple times per day, but doesn't give an exact rule on this. Another option that it gives is a +1, +2, +3 bonus by rarity, and this can be applied to armor class, attack rolls, saving throws, and ability checks. So for instance, a rare magic item could give you a +2 to a specific saving throw. Like I said, it's pretty simple and not super great for thinking creatively and making really interesting or wacky magic items, but it gives you somewhere to start with a power level idea of what a magic item could do if you were making up your own. Moving on to XANATHAR'S guide, the rules here go a little more in depth in some ways, and honestly overall are just quite a bit better. The idea here seems to be to kind of focus more on the narrative of crafting and avoid punishing people with long wait times in order to make overall fairly mundane things. For non-magical item creation, there is, much like the other rules, a tool proficiency required depending on what item you're trying to make, and 1/2 the cost of the base cost of the item is required to be brought up in raw material in order to craft it. The time required is measured in work weeks here, which, to put simply, is just 5 days at a time instead of a single day. In order to determine how many work weeks have to be spent, you take the cost of the item in gold pieces and you divide it by 50. So a 200 gold item would be 4 work weeks or 20 days of work. You can reduce this number further by having additional characters assist. They do go on a note here that it must be a reasonable number of people for the item to be created, and they all still need to have an appropriate tool proficiency. So you couldn't have 5 people crafting 1 ring or something like that. In this case, you would take that original base cost in gold, divide it by 50, and then whatever number's left there, you would divide that by the number of characters working on it. Let's give another example of this, similar to how we did for the DMG. If you were crafting plate armor, it would once again cost you 750 gold pieces, being half the base cost of the item. The time required to create this would be 30 work weeks for an individual person crafting. This would mean 150 days of work. If instead 3 characters work together to craft it, it would take 10 work weeks, or 50 days. The math of this seems kind of complicated, and honestly, to put it in words, it kind of is, but when you actually get down to it, it's fairly straightforward once you get a good grasp of how it works. Next, let's talk about the magical item crafting in XANATHAR'S guide. Much like the DMG, a formula is required. You have to know or find a formula in order to craft a magic item. Along with this, you need a appropriate tool proficiency or the Arcana skill. It's worded in that way in the book, which is a little confusing to me. You could have the tool proficiency or the Arcana skill. We'll kind of go over that in my advice at the end here, but I have some opinions about that. An exotic material is almost always required, And this, instead of being just randomly determined by the DM or something like that, the DMG leaves no real hard rules here. XANATHAR'S breaks it down in a challenge rating for a monster to be faced system. So by the rarity of the item, it gives a range of challenge ratings for a monster that you would either harvest the item from, or this creature might be guarding the location where the item can be found. This makes it so that to craft a magic item, you kind of have to go on an adventure. If you're wanting to make a rare magic item, you may have to go and fight a CR 9 to 12 monster that's an appropriate thing thematically for the item being crafted. If it was a sword that could light on fire, maybe you have to get the source of that flame from a powerful red dragon or something like that. It also has a cost in gold pieces and time, much like any of the other crafting rules. This is broken down by rarity and measured in work weeks and gold pieces. An example would be common magic item would take 1 work week or 5 days and cost you 50 gold pieces. These amounts are cut in half for any consumable item. So if you were making something that has a one-time use, you would take those numbers and just divide them by 2. To use our original example from the DMG, a Staff of Healing, a rare magic item, would require a formula, a tool proficiency, or the Arcana skill appropriate to that item, and then you'd have to go and have some sort of an encounter with a creature, challenge rating 9 to 12. You would then spend 10 work weeks, or 50 days, and 2,000 gold pieces in order to craft the item using that rare material found in that encounter with the CR 9 to 12 creature. A brief side note here, the rules do not explicitly say that multiple characters can work on magic items together in XANATHAR'S Guide, at least not in the magic item section itself. My opinion is that they should be able to, and I will go over that here in a little bit, but it doesn't explicitly say in the rules, just so you know. XANATHAR'S Guide goes on to go into further detail about how to craft healing potions and spell scrolls. Instead of using the base magic item rules, they each have their own charts describing costs for making them. For a healing potion, the cost is separated by potency of healing potion. So a basic, greater, superior, and supreme healing potion each have different costs and time requirements. A basic healing potion takes 1 day and 25 gold pieces, whereas a supreme is 4 work weeks and 10,000 gold pieces. An appropriate herbalism kit knowledge is still required in order to make these, but no further formulas or checks are explicitly required. Spell scrolls require the Arcana skill, material components for the spell being scribed, and the individual scribing the spell scroll must know the spell being written down. It must be a spell on their spell sheet. Spell scrolls have a time and gold piece requirement, much like the other crafting rules, and this is broken down by spell level. A cantrip takes a single day and 15 gold pieces to be scribed onto a spell scroll, whereas a 5th level spell would require 4 work weeks and 5,000 gold pieces to be written onto a spell scroll. This is the quick breakdown of all the kind of basic crafting rules that you can find in XANATHAR'S Guide. Now I'm going to go over my opinion on everything and how I think best you can use these rules in your own game. My first opinion is basically take everything I talked about in the DMG and throw it out the window. I would disregard these rules more or less entirely. They are punishing and time-consuming without really adding to the story you're trying to tell, and XANATHAR'S is just overall a much better set of rules, so I wouldn't bother with the DMG rules at all. As far as the XANATHAR rules, they are good, but I would suggest a few small tweaks or just ways of viewing the crafting process when using these rules. For the non-magical crafting rules in XANATHAR'S Guide, I would use them more or less as is written. One recommendation I would make is to be very lenient on who can help in the crafting process. For instance, if a character with smith's tools is making a suit of plate armor, I would definitely let a player with leatherworking proficiency also help them, making the straps or the undergarments, things like that. It makes the timetable a lot shorter so that these mundane items can be made and the action can resume. As for the magical items, there's a couple of recommendations I would make. The first one is to kind of address that Arcana skill replacing tool proficiency idea that is delivered in the base rules. This makes sense sometimes and doesn't make sense other times. If somebody's making a magical wand, more or less any stick could be used, so you don't necessarily need woodcarver's tools. But if someone's making a suit of plate armor, you can't just magically make that work, at least not in my opinion. It kind of depends on the world you're running and the rules that you want to use, but I would kind of take that on a case-by-case basis, whether the Arcana skill can outright replace a tool proficiency. Another option here is just, if they're making a magical suit of armor, that you make them already have a mundane suit of that armor at the time of crafting if they don't have the tool proficiency to craft it during that process. A couple other changes I would make. Simple formulas for simple magic items, things like a bag of holding, should be easily obtainable. I don't think that a massive epic quest needs to be had in order to find a recipe for making a bag of holding. In the same vein, simple magic items do not or should not require exotic materials if it's in at least a somewhat high magic setting. Same idea here. If your character is just trying to make a quality of life little magic item like a bag of holding, it doesn't really need to be a big epic quest where they have to go and slay a monster of a certain challenge rating in order to get some hide to make it or something along those lines. Make it a little easier and more obtainable so that those quest magic items that they craft later on can be the real impactful story things. Also, with this challenge rating chart, I would use it more as a guideline than a hard rule. If a higher or lower CR creature would make a lot of sense for an item that your characters are trying to craft, you can always adjust things in an encounter to make it more or less challenging. So you might as well use the creature that makes a whole lot of sense instead of just trying to find something that could make sense and fits inside of that chart's narrow window of challenge rating. The story matters more there, so just make it make sense. In the same idea with this encounter, it needs to be appropriately challenging for the rarity of the item being made, but that doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be deadly. For example, a social encounter where the players are having to negotiate to get access to the materials needed in order to make a particular item can be a very interesting and fun encounter, and can be very challenging depending on who they're negotiating with. And it can still meet that sort of challenge rating encounter requirement without the players having to explicitly go and fight a monster somewhere. I would also go with the way that I assume the rules are kind of assumed and not explicitly written, and allow multiple characters to work on magic item crafting together, so long as they can all supply a needed skill. Tool proficiency, arcana skill, spells, spell slots, etc. Then I would divide the time to craft these items by the number of characters, like the rule for mundane item crafting, using the same limitations. So a 5-person team couldn't really all work together on the same magical ring. To round this talk out, I'm going to go over a couple of class and racial specific bonuses that could be used and kind of brought into play here in the crafting conversation. The first of these is Artificers. Artificers are craftsmen. That's the whole point of people playing Artificers. And in a older version of the Artificer class, they used to get reductions to the gold piece and time costs for crafting items in their specialty. My recommendation is to bring this back. As was written in the Unearthed Arcana, they used to have 1/4 of the time cost and 1/2 of the gold piece cost for crafting items using a tool proficiency granted to them by their Artificer specialist choice. I think this is a really cool, rewarding thing for a player who wants to craft and likes to craft. If you're worried that this will make the game a little too plug and play, lots of crafting being done, them just using magic items to solve every problem, you can try and limit this and bring it back, maybe adjust to 1/2 of the time required and the same cost. That would avoid overuse. But honestly, the rule as was written in that, I think, is pretty fair and gives the Artificer that feeling of being the individual who can craft the items that their specialty says they can, instead of just like anyone else who has the ability to make potions from an herbalist kit. It'll make your Artificers feel like an Artificer, so I recommend bringing that back. There are also some racial abilities that can come into play here with crafting. A good example of this is the lizard folk. They have a small number of items that they can craft out of creature remains as part of their just racial abilities. I would definitely allow abilities like this to come into play as a replacement for a tool proficiency or something along those lines when crafting items or magic items. So long as it's a magical weapon or shield that meets the requirement of the items the lizard folk can create, I would totally let that be used in place of a tool proficiency, so long as that's the type of material, creature remains, being used to craft a magical version of that item. Alright, so that is the crafting rules broken down for the DMG, XANATHAR'S Guide, and my opinions on how to best use them. In a sort of summarization of this, don't use the DMG rules, they're out of date, XANATHAR'S are just better. And use XANATHAR'S rules, but make a couple of slight adjustments as will fit your magical power level in your game. Remember that the point of this game is for everyone to have fun, and to not punish people for wanting to be creative and have their crafting character craft things. Don't focus so much on realism that you take away from gameplay. You want your player who chose to make a character who's good at building things to be good at building things, and so long as you don't have a group of players who are constantly trying to break the system and cheat the rules so their characters can be overpowered, I think most players will use it in a way that is more for feeling like the cool, powerful crafting character than to just try and solve problems in a way that's easy and unfun.
So that has been the 5th edition crafting rules, how they work, which parts of it are good and bad, our opinion on that. Down below in the description, I've made a little document that's just a couple of charts breaking down XANATHAR'S Guide's rules on crafting for magical crafting scrolls, healing potions, and the formula that you need to use for crafting with just any generic non-magical mundane items. Just so you can have it all in one spot. It's useful. We're going to have it to use and want to just supply it for all of you guys if you want to try and use it yourself, just to make things all in one place. We hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave a like. Please comment down below any cool crafting homebrew rules you maybe have used in the past, or ways you've altered the rules from XANATHAR'S to make them work just a little bit better in your game. Now go forth, slay dragons, sling spells, roll dice, and enjoy your downtime activities.